continue our series called The Better Story as we've traced in wide brushstrokes through the story of the Bible. And today we're reached the New Testament, and we're thinking about the Messiah and the love that Jesus has for us as well. And the whole premise of the series is that to have full assurance of faith in a world of many competing stories and ideas and headlines, to be able to hold unswervingly to the hope that we can have even though the world is in chaos, and to spur one another on towards love and good deeds even though individualism is pushing us to be more isolated and lonely, then we need a better story. And that is what the Bible gives us. And perhaps all of us here today have found that to be absolutely true in our own lives when we have encountered the story that we have written for us. That this story is still relevant, it's still contemporary, it's still immediate, it's still inviting, and it is still life-changing. And when people pick it up and begin to read it, then it has transformation on every page as we allow God to speak his word, his living and powerful word for each of our days. We've been looking at a whole series of questions over this time, and our question for today is, who is the source of love? I know you know the answer to that, don't you? Because the answer to every question is Jesus. Yeah, okay. Well, we'll go for Jesus today. It doesn't really matter. But love is one of those odd things that we sort of know something about. We've probably experienced. We may have said it to somebody else as well. And we've used the word perhaps sometimes in the most meaningful way, but perhaps in other ways to maybe get what we want sometimes as well. But it's true that at the heart of every human being is this desire to be loved and also to love, to give something of what we have. And it's not a surprise, is it, of course, given that we're made in the image of God, as we thought about a few weeks ago in the book of Genesis. And of course, God's essence is love itself. In 1 John chapter 4 and verse 16, God is love, writes the apostle. And that love, of course, finds itself in expression in giving away so that everyone would benefit from it. For God so loved the world that he gave. So God is love, but he also expresses that love. And that is at the heart of the love that we seek to give and to receive as well. He gave us his Son to save the world through love. And Jesus demonstrated that love to us, of course, throughout his time here on earth. It's always intriguing to see who Jesus loved. And in the gospel stories, of course, we meet many, many different characters that perhaps we might find it hard to love. And yet Jesus somehow was able to reach out with this love that was his essence. He loved Nicodemus, the Pharisee who came to Jesus at night seeking truth, longing to be loved for who he was, not for what he did through religious ritual or through routine. He loved the Samaritan woman at the well in the middle of the day, on her own, isolated from community, who had come to draw water, longing to be loved, longing to be accepted, longing to be included for who she was, even though her background as a Samaritan woman had isolated her from many other people. He loved tax collectors, of course, and sinners and prostitutes, the 5,000 who sat down on the ground that day waiting to be fed, the children who were brought to him, much to the indignation of the disciples, the man born blind, Lazarus, who was in a tomb, Judas and Peter as well. It seems to me that it's God's choice to love, and it's our choice to receive it or turn away from it. And yet we use the word love so glibly, don't we? I mean, I do love rice pudding and custard. I have to say that. That is the honest truth today. I do love it, along with many other things that I'm able to love. But, of course, the love of God is something much deeper and much wider and much higher than any of the love that I could express for rice pudding, especially with skin on. If anybody's good at making rice pudding with skin on, bring one Sunday morning for me, won't you? Love the skin. But it's the sort of love that goes beyond, of course, the superficiality of the love that we often express, right to the very source. And tracing that love right to the source of it helps us to begin to understand perhaps the extent of it as well. And yet there's so much more, isn't there? There's so much more love from God that we have yet to even begin to mine and experience. And often our love is too often selfish, sometimes at the expense of others, sometimes in order to win favor or to gain some reward. But the kind of love that God has, of course, is this agape love, this beautiful Greek word that is so difficult to define, and yet it's right at the heart of the Bible story. Dallas Willard, a more modern theologian, he defines love. You see, he needs so many different words to define love. It is not an action or a feeling or emotion, nor indeed an intention. It is an overall disposition of the human self that alone does justice to the teachings of Jesus. Such love is holistic, not something one turns on or off for this or that person or thing. Its orientation is toward life as a whole. It dwells on good wherever it may be found, supports it in action. Love is nourished upon the good and the right and the beautiful. And yet even that paragraph is not enough to define the love that God has for you and for me this morning, for the world. But this kind of love that comes from the source of love, that is what begins to reshape a world as we receive it and as we choose to share it with all those who we encounter as well. Joining God in his intended purposes for every person we meet every single day. In Matthew chapter 22, Jesus said this, when asked by the Pharisee who came to him, said, what's the greatest commandment? Well, Jesus spoke of the commandment that they would have known. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, enshrined in the Old Testament story for all who would profess some faith in God. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And these two go together in Jesus' eyes, love for God and love for neighbor. And they both share the same Greek word in our text, agape, agapeo. It's not a static word, it's an active word. It's something more than just being doled out love into our lives. It's about what are we going to do with it next? How are we going to respond to it? The love received has to be bounced back to love given as well, not only back to God, but also to those who we consider our neighbor. And that's the choice. That's the decision, whether we are prepared to reflect that love, like some powerful mirror reflecting God's love back into the life of others, not in our own strength and power, not in love that we feel we can build up in us, but in God's love received and reflected back into the lives of other people. Because it seems to me that God's preference is to love. And when we love others, then we're saying to them, let me show you how Jesus loves you. Let me show you a reflection of the love that I have received from Jesus in how I respond to you and talk to you and serve you and honor you, to make the same choice that God makes towards you and me today, to drink love from the very source itself, before it gets contaminated, before it goes on its journey, to drink from the very source and give it generously to others as well. Of course, that first line that Jesus quoted is very familiar to the Jews, the Jewish Shema, to love God with all our heart. It was recited by every Jew. Everybody would have known this phrase, would have known it off by heart from being very young. But of course, the challenge Jesus offers to them and to us is not just to recite it, but at the heart of it is to obey it, to act upon it. And for us who follow Jesus, then, to do that in the way that Jesus demonstrated that love to us as well. Back in the Hebrew, when this text in Deuteronomy comes from, the Hebrew word is ahava. And ahava is not some warm and fuzzy and emotional energy we feel when we like someone. It has this word that attaches to it this sense of listening, of being present in that moment. To love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength is to give your full attention to God, to listen actively to what God has to say to you. That's the sense that comes from the Hebrew text for us. You are someone when you act in loyalty and faithfulness to them, when you stand with them, when you listen to them, even though you've heard the same story 100 times, you stand and listen to it one more time. And with loyalty, you stay strong with that person that you're seeking to love and share God's love with. This was the Israelites' covenant relationship with God. All through Deuteronomy, you'll see this time and time again. It's not about legalism. It's not about trying to earn God's favor. It's about giving God full attention, listening to him, and acting in response to the love that you've received from him as well. When you love God like that, then you listen attentively and you respond to the teachings and guidance that he would want to give. They're so tightly connected, these words, listen and love. You'll find them all over the Deuteronomy story. And it's easy to love humanity, isn't it? It's easy to love people we know about, but it's hard to choose to decide to love people we actually know sometimes. To walk with them, to live with them, to work with them. For of course we see their faults and failings so clearly. And the flip side of that is that they see your faults and failings and mine just the same. In Matthew 5, Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven." Children, trusting, honest, responsive, to do what he's asked us to do. To love our enemies with the same love that Jesus has for us. To pray for those who persecute in the same way as Jesus would fall on his knees and pray for those who were against him. To love those who are hostile, to love those who inflict harm, people who we have seemingly irreconcilable differences with, are enemies. Yet, of course, that is the next challenge that is offered to a God who loves us because he loves us. Of course, we cannot do this on ourselves. We need to experience the source of love again, the Messiah, the Christ, the Anointed One who came to demonstrate God's love for us, who made a choice out of love to demonstrate it through the cross. Romans 5:8, God demonstrates, shows us, reflects us, his own love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we were still far away, he died for us. Before we ever gave him a thought, Christ died for us. And while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son. Someone who loves their enemies, people like us, shows us really what lies at the heart of this kind of love. And not only loved us, but of course, Jesus died for us while we were enemies. And that's the love we're invited to receive, and once we've received it, it's the kind of love that we make a choice to give to others as well. We love because he first loved us. What a difference we could make in the world, one life at a time, as we choose to and decide to do just that.